So, how does a country choose to face the world? I mean, does it build walls or does it build bridges? Does it try to go it alone or does it team up with others? You might think it's a simple choice between war and peace, but it's really not. A nation's relationship with the rest of the globe, it actually exists on this wide, really fascinating spectrum of engagement.
Okay, so take a look at this. This isn't just some grand building in Moscow. No, this is the backdrop for some seriously high-stakes diplomacy. Inside, you've got major world powers like the United States and Russia, and they're meeting to try and figure out how to resolve the absolutely devastating conflict in Syria. And think about it. That's a war happening thousands of miles away from either of their capitals. And that, right there, brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. Why? I mean, what on earth drives a nation to get involved in these incredibly complex situations so far from their own borders? And on the flip side, what makes them decide to just stay out of it? Well, the answer to all of that lies somewhere along that spectrum of foreign policy choices we just mentioned. All right, so let's start at one extreme end of that spectrum. We're talking about the conscious choice to just withdraw from the world stage, to turn inward, and basically to stand completely alone.
This idea has a name, and it's called isolationism. The core thinking behind it is actually pretty simple. You aim for peace and self-sufficiency by avoiding what people often call foreign entanglements. It's a philosophy that's been surprisingly influential throughout history, and believe me, it's still being debated like crazy today.
And this really gets to the heart of the whole debate, right? It's a real tug of war. On one hand, the people who are for it say, hey, this protects our local jobs, it preserves our unique culture, and most importantly, it keeps us out of expensive bloody wars. But then the critics fire back arguing it can totally stall out your economy, and that, in a world this connected, it's basically just walking away from your responsibilities. And listen, this isn't just some academic theory. This has happened in the real world. I mean, look at Japan. From 1641 all the way to 1853, their Taikeen policy basically cut off contact with the outside world. And the result? One of the longest periods of peace in the country's entire history. And then you've got this wild story from 19th century Paraguay, where a dictator sealed the border so tight that if a foreigner came in, they were often stuck there for the rest of their lives. No joke.
Okay, but avoiding war doesn't have to mean completely withdrawing from the world. There's another point on our spectrum, and it's a philosophy of being actively and morally engaged with the world, just, without the violence. And this path is called pacifism. And check out this quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now remember, this guy was a 5-star general and a U.S. president, so he knew a thing or two about the military. And he said that massive military spending is, and I'm quoting here, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. Wow, that just frames the whole pacifist argument, not as some lofty ideal, but as a really practical, down-to-earth choice about what a country should prioritize.
This iconic picture just captures that sentiment so perfectly. It really shows you that pacifism isn't about being passive, not at all. It's an active and frankly often incredibly courageous philosophy of confronting violence head-on, but with nonviolence. So the key thing to get here is that pacifism is, at its core, about being opposed to war and violence. Now, that opposition can come from a couple of places. It might be rooted in a really deep moral or religious belief. Or it could be based on a more practical view that, hey, war is just a terrible, super expensive way to solve our problems. And the historical impact of this idea, it's just undeniable. You can literally trace a direct line from Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent truth force movement in India to Martin Luther King Jr.'s brilliant strategies in the American civil rights movement, all the way to this unforgettable image of the tank man, one single person peacefully standing up to a column of tanks. But, and this is a big but, this approach is not without some profound risks. Take the story of the Moriori people of the Chatham Islands. Their entire culture was built on strict pacifism. So when they were invaded in 1835, their refusal to fight back led to them being almost completely wiped out, slaughtered and enslaved. It's just a tragic, sobering reminder of the brutal real-world complexities this philosophy can run into. Okay, so we've looked at turning away from the world. Now let's jump all the way to the other end of the spectrum. This is where powerful nations don't just get involved, they actively try to control what happens in other countries. There's something called spheres of influence.
So what in the world is a sphere of influence? Well, think of it as a region where a big, powerful outside country has all the say.
This isn't like old-school colonial rule where they plant a flag. Instead, it means that country's culture, its economy, and its politics are the dominant force, and all the other big powers are basically expected to stay out. It's a way for a nation to project its power without having to go through the trouble of a full-on military occupation. I mean, this cartoon basically says it all. You've got Uncle Sam pretty much putting up a giant do not enter sign over the entire Western Hemisphere. And that was the whole point of the U.S. Monroe Doctrine back in the 19th century. It was a classic example of declaring a sphere of influence. It was a clear warning to all the European empires, stay out of our backyard. And history is just full of these invisible lines being drawn. The Cold War is a perfect example. The entire globe was basically split into two gigantic spheres of influence, one led by the US and the other by the Soviet Union. And then you have something even more shocking, the secret pact between Nazi Germany and the USSR in 1939, where they literally sat down and carved up Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe between themselves.
So what does it actually feel like to be a smaller country caught in the middle of one of these big power contests? Well, this 1878 cartoon just nails it. You see Persia being squeezed between the Russian bear and the British lion, both fighting for control in Central Asia. It's like being caught between a rock and a hard place, an incredibly vulnerable position to be in.
But what happens when a nation's sphere of influence gets so big, so powerful, that it's not just influence anymore, it's outright dominance? Well, that brings us to the very last stop on our foreign policy spectrum, a little thing called hegemony.
Hegemony. The term actually comes from an ancient Greek word hegemon, which means leader. And this is way more than just influence. We're talking about the total predominance of one single state over all the others. And this idea is absolutely central to how we talk about global power today. Are we in a unipolar world with one top dog, a bipolar world with two, or a multipolar world with a bunch of powers all competing? Now, it's really important to get this distinction. This is different from old-school imperialism. A hegemon, or the leader state, doesn't necessarily have to invade and occupy other countries. Its dominance is much more subtle. It's indirect. It rules through the implied threat of its massive power. It convinces other countries to fall in line using a mix of pressure and persuasion. All right, so we've traveled the entire spectrum here, from total isolationism to principled pacifism, all the way to absolute hegemony. Now let's bring it all full circle and see how this whole framework can help us make sense of the incredibly complicated global conflicts we see playing out today.
So if we look again at a conflict like the one in Syria, we can see it's not some simple two-sided fight. It's a messy, tangled-up web where all of these concepts we've talked about are crashing into each other. You've got competing spheres of influence with different outside powers backing different sides. And at the same time, you've got these loud arguments for intervention clashing with desperate calls for a peaceful, pacifist-style resolution. And stuck in the middle of all that complexity, this is the ultimate challenge. This quote here from former Secretary of State John Kerry, which he said right before those Moscow talks on Syria, just captures it perfectly. In a world full of competing powers and clashing interests, that's the hardest part, and probably the most important part, finding that common ground. And all of this leaves us with one final big question. We've seen the dangers of getting involved, for sure, and we've seen the potential benefits of staying out. But in a world as deeply interconnected as ours is now, where a crisis in one country can send shockwaves across the entire globe, what really is the true cost of just looking away?